Welcome to The Hill's Coronavirus Report. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Each day we are interviewing consequential thought leaders in the battle against the coronavirus. Perhaps one of the greatest casualties from the coronavirus is trust. Trust in government, in news organizations, maybe in young people partying during spring break on Florida beaches. Trust all across society. Trust is the secret sauce of systems that work. And without trust, just about everything else falls apart. One of the annual measures I pay careful attention to is the Edelman Trust Barometer that does polling and careful analysis of the levels of trust people have in all sorts of different kinds of institutions. Richard Edelman is president and CEO of Edelman Public Relations, and Richard launched some special editions of his Trust Barometer to look at the impact of the coronavirus on society's trust in government, in business, in the media, and more. And we are lucky to have him here today to help us understand who stands out in the world of trust and who does not. Richard, welcome. Thanks so much for joining me today. Let me just get right at the fundamental question. You know, if you're looking at unemployment figures today that are sky high in the United States, and you look at the White House recommending that we, that some potentially inject disinfectants, you have some companies out there, who've been quiet, some that have been deployed. Can you give us a quick picture of the state of trust in America right now?
So I think the most important fact for listeners is business has to step into the void left by lack of quality information. The media is seen as politicized. Government is seen as episodic. And so whether you're a corporation or your brand, you have a duty to inform your employees who then can share that information more broadly. And you also have an obligation to be in the business of solutions and not selling. You should be seen as somehow helping this country get back on its feet, to keep as many people as you can employed, to include small businesses in the supply chain, and make sure that you are looking to be a member of your community, that you're giving away food, that you're giving away product or time, and that you're protecting your employees above all.
Well, I'm interested. I read your report, and one of the lines which you just mentioned is to companies and CEOs is to help solve, not sell. And I'm fascinated by that because we've seen some do well at this. We saw some price gouging in the business. We saw a lot of scrambling for masks. Who do you think has stood out as some of the companies that have helped to solve and not to sell?
Well, I think two or three good examples. Unilever pledged to keep not only its employees, but also its suppliers. For instance, Sodexo operating the company cafeteria in New Jersey, even if the place is closed, they're paying those people through June. At the same time, Unilever has also expanded its financing terms for its small vendors and for its suppliers. And so that's really making, in a certain way, a company like a bank. Also, I think Starbucks is now trying to reopen, but with different terms, that they're somehow making sure that customers feel safe, that they do a drive-in or whatever and have a different service modality. Also, Farmers Insurance cut the rates of its auto insurance by 25%. So each one of these in its own way is a significant action. That's the point for companies. Don't just talk, do something.
One of the other interesting elements that I read in one of your reports was essentially the ascension of science. I would have always thought that science was a trusted voice, that doctors, that people with knowledge and expertise were looked at. But it comes out loud and clear that there is even more trust put in those voices than there are in journalists like myself, in political leaders around the country. And I think it's important because we've seen science attacked to some degree on many fronts, not just in the last several years, but before. And I'm interested in your insights into what's going on there and what the implications are for other institutions.
People trust those who have credentials. So technical experts from a company or even more scientists. But they also trust those who are close to them. So for instance, my employer CEO or friends and family or peers at the company, because trust usually used to be conveyed vertically and then has moved horizontal, and now has moved local, to something close to me. So it's today some combination of scientific fact and people who, in a certain way, I work with all the time. My peers, or even more, my CEO. That puts big obligations on my employer to speak to me frequently. I want updates every day on what's happening with our policies, return to work. Am I going to go back to work with a mask? Am I going to go back to work an A and B shift? Am I going to go in some way without a company cafeteria so that I have some mandatory social distancing? Everybody wants to know specifics. They don't just want to get facts through social media. Social media is deeply distrusted right now because there's too much fake news. Mainstream media is increasingly trusted, but sometimes seen as politicized. So Fox on the right, New York Times on the left. And so I need business in a certain way as the plug between.
You know, one of the things I've started doing every day is watching my colleagues on Rising, on Hill TV, Crystal Ball and Sagar Enjeti, and they have a lot of viewers around the country that just don't buy the line that this bailout, that the CARE legislation that bailed out both people but also businesses is something that's not corrupt. And I've watched Shake Shack and other companies return the checks that they've gotten. And I'm interested in how you would recommend corporations swimming in this lane of doubt as they see so many people undermine whether or not they what they can do.
I think that people accept the idea that hotels or airlines or others whose businesses have been crippled by COVID, that they get some government support. What they don't accept is the idea that a retailer, restaurant chain, others who seem to have a good business prospect of getting bailed out. And the Los Angeles Lakers returned $4 million yesterday. They shouldn't have taken it in the first place. We have to be really careful, just as in 2008 and 2009, on getting government bailouts. And if we do, they should be merited and they should be paid back. And there should be transparency as to how they're used.
Well, one of the things that really also jumped out about the report related to this is that many of the people that you polled and talked to said that they were willing to punish brands. In fact, this is a global poll. I mean, you've got China, India, South Korea, South Africa, Germany, France, all in this poll. It's fascinating to watch the global perspectives about this. But there's doubt around the world in companies that are duplicitous and that people are willing to punish them. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, 3/4 of people said that they would stop using a brand if they felt as if they were somehow exploiting the situation. Pretending to end COVID by getting rid of dandruff, for instance. That's ludicrous. On the other hand, 1/3 of people said they've already changed brands because of the acts of responsibility taken by brands. So in a way, I believe in brand democracy. The idea that somehow I have more power through what I buy every day than I do voting every 4 years. And so I really want to have to be a belief-driven buyer, and I fundamentally want brands to stand for me during this terrible time.
You and I have talked about your trust barometer in previous years. I really love it. I find it fascinating. And in earlier years, you saw business really taking it on the chin, that they were not looking at as trusted voices and trusted players in the economy. Does this COVID crisis create an opportunity for them to reprove themselves and to come back in an upward cycle?
I think in two industries in particular, there's a real opportunity. So financial services has really been the bottom dweller for the last decade, ever since the financial crisis. And it started to build back with JP Morgan and Wells Fargo and others trying to rebuild communities, Detroit, et cetera. That's a big moment now because banks are distributing the PPP funds. What else can they be doing to get money to small business in particular? The other is tech. For the first time last Davos, Steve, we found that tech was no longer the most trusted industry in 1/3 of the countries that we survey. That's a big warning sign for tech. So either tech is a force for good here, enabling e-commerce, somehow enabling us to work from home in a safe way, or it's seen as a way of helping the wealthy make a bigger difference to the disadvantaged who can't do this kind of education at home, et cetera. So tech really has to play carefully in trying to provide product to those who don't normally participate.
Richard, what advice or counsel would you give the White House through this? Because the White House doesn't fare very well either. In terms of trusted voices, as I sort of looked at it, there are doctors that are ahead. People looked at their neighbors as more trustable than they did their country's leader, if I was reading your data correctly. And, this is a president, President Trump, who thinks about branding and brands all the time. And what does he need to do a better job than he is of connecting at a trust level with the American public on this virus?
I think the president's done a really good job of being available and being present and frequent. Where I think he could use a little more message discipline is not thinking aloud and making sure that he has credible sources such as Dr. Anthony Fauci and others around him who are carrying the science message. A president needs to be empathetic. He needs to be specific about federal aid to small business, but he needs to leave the science to those who are scientists. That's a very clear steer from our trust study, which said that 80% trust scientists, 40% trust politicians. They don't want this politicized. They want solutions that work and that are tangible.
Another sector I've been talking to are scientists at pharmaceutical firms. And everyone I've talked to says, hey, the answer to this is eventually going to be vaccines and antivirals that the pharmaceutical industry produces. But if you look at the reactions in the American public out there, they may know that's true, but they still don't trust the pharmaceuticals on things like cost and accessibility. And I'm interested in how, if you have any insights from your research that gives a way for pharmaceuticals to navigate this better, because they could come up with a vaccine, but still end up being public enemy number one.
So I think the pharma companies have an important, maybe once in a generation opportunity here to be heroes. First, to give us some degree of immunity. Second, some certainty about whether we have the condition. But third, affordable, consistent product. And that we find it's distributed in a fair way, not just to those who have a lot of money, and also in a way that's not too nationalistic. One of the problems of being a multinational is you may make the product in Singapore, and then you're pulled by the president to bring it all to the U.S. instead of supplying it evenly across the world. So I think the real chance here is for pharma companies to have heroes. And it won't be the CEOs. It'll be the medical directors or the scientist who comes up with the new vaccine. And have the bench person with the white coat, the woman who comes up with the great idea, make that the face of the company. It's really a chance.
Just in our last minute, Richard, I know that you're one of the best crises advisors in the world for people that have had a shock in trust. They've got a bad airplane. They've got, whatever it may be. And I sort of feel like we're in this high stress moment where re-achieving social trust across the board is going to be very tough. Imagine a crisis that a big company has gone through that they're doubted. They were beaten up by the president on masks or on supply chains. What are the 2 or 3 most important things for that brand of reestablishing itself as a trusted player with its consumers?
I want to go back to the premise of solutions and not selling. I want that company to definitely be seen as a major partner of this country in solving COVID, and that the commitment is more than financial, it's actually spiritual, and that the CEO, the board, and employees all reflect this drive to achieve a solution, and that we want to be on the side of the angels, on the side of our employees and keeping them working, and also on the side of our communities, so that we're giving away product, that we're somehow really pitching in to make this as short a crisis as we can.
Richard, I always learn when we have these conversations. Thank you for educating me and all of our viewers today. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for joining me today. See you tomorrow. I'm Steve Clemons. Be well.